Hello and welcome to our podcast on what we are calling Dangling Causes. This is actually a term in film that we use for something that you already know from your literature classes. And basically that term is foreshadowing. So let's go ahead and see what we're talking about here. So just like in any literature class where an author might use foreshadowing to kind of give hints as to what's coming up later in the story, film directors do the same thing. So foreshadowing is the use of hints or clues to suggest future action. And oftentimes authors are giving us these clues. They do want us to understand where the story is going. They do want to subtly reveal what's going to be happening in the climax. And it's our job to try and figure out what's going to happen ahead of time. And so that reading strategy of predicting is a good way to kind of push yourself to figure out what's going on ahead of time. And so in literature class, we call this foreshadowing. In film class, we call these dangling causes. And so why does this matter? Authors do plant clues, and they do hope or expect us to pick up on these subtle patterns that are often found in literature and in film. And the end game, the end climax, should not be some sort of massive, complete out-of-left-field shock. If we are reading the film correctly, we should see where it's going, for the most part. We should be familiar with the grammar of film. We should understand the flow of story. We should understand the different stages that films often take. And we should be able to kind of predict where this is going. And so what makes foreshadowing, and in this case dangling causes, so great is that if we are picking up on the clues, then we're kind of predicting where this is going. And the author wants us to do that. But what he or she is going to do is going to retain the how and when that reveal happens. So we may be expecting some sort of massive finale climax, but we're not going to get that until the director is ready to let us have that. And so that's pretty cool. Builds suspension, builds tension, and as we kind of read the grammar of film, we know what's coming, but we don't know exactly when. That's something that the director keeps for him or herself. And so oftentimes the challenge of finding foreshadowing is that we are not adept at picking up the cues. We're not seeing the grammar of the piece that we're looking at. In our literature classes, we talk about 5 different ways that authors foreshadow, and we drill these into our students and say, hey, this is kind of how authors do it. When characters have dreams, those dreams matter. When characters are giving or receiving warnings or curses, those usually come true. When a character is overconfident or cocky, tends to come back to bite them in the butt. When we have a static character, or who we think is a static character, that character is going to maintain his or her personality throughout the whole novel. So if at the beginning we see a character who always gets into trouble, you can probably guess that by the end, he or she is also going to get into trouble. And then the last way we use in a literature class is what we call abundant attention. So if an author continues to go back to the same motif or the same theme or the same color, that's probably an indication of either symbolism or that those ideas being repeated are going to matter in some significant way later. In film, just like literature, oftentimes these ways of foreshadowing are pretty subtle, and sometimes we don't understand what we're seeing until we've gotten to the end. Of course that was going to happen at the end of Mice and Men. Of course that was going to happen at the end of Star Wars, or whatever. What we're trying to push people to do is trying to see the grammar of film before this stuff happens, and try to view the films actively and see if we can predict what the foreshadowing is and how it's going to reveal itself. And so just like we have the 5 big things in literature class that tend to be the grammar of foreshadowing, here are some of the pieces of grammar of foreshadowing in film. If we see the camera slowly linger on something, meaning that it kind of pauses and forces us to look at it for maybe a little bit longer than we would normally just look at something if we were a human being, that camera lingering is probably telling us that that item is important in some way. Another way is the use of close-up. Technically, a close-up is when some image on the screen fills about 80% of that screen. And so if the director is choosing to close up on something, it's probably going to be important. Now, it could be important because that's a massive symbol to help reveal the theme, but it could also be that that idea is going to come out and be important later on. And then the third piece of film grammar that kind of gives us some hints at foreshadowing is the idea of just completely random items. And often these random items come in the form of a close-up or a camera lingering. But when some story is being told, one scene is developing, and all of a sudden the camera cuts away to look at something else, and you're like, what is that? Where'd that come from? And it seems a little random. That is probably the use of foreshadowing. And so again, in film, we call this idea of foreshadowing the use of dangling causes. So here is its formal definition. A dangling cause is something you see or hear early on in the film, but takes a while to develop, and then eventually it does return to the film in some important way, which is basically foreshadowing. So here are some examples from some pretty famous and important movies that oftentimes use foreshadowing and dangling causes to complete their story. One example comes from the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And at the very beginning, we see as Indy is running away from some tribespeople as he has taken the golden idol from them. He climbs into his friend's plane to help escape, and he looks down and notices that there is a snake in the cockpit. And at that point, Indy reveals that he hates snakes. It's the worst thing ever for him. Fine, kind of a random thing to have a snake in a plane, except for the stupid movie Snakes on a Plane, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, eventually, as we watch the whole movie, they're searching for the Lost Ark, blah, blah, blah. Eventually, they do find it. And eventually, as they pull the top back from the tomb where the Ark is hidden, we can see that it is guarded by something. And of course, that something has to be snakes. Of course, we had that random exclamation before that Indy hates snakes. Therefore, it would only seem logical that the thing guarding that which he wants the most, the Ark, is that which he hates the most, the snakes. And so there we have a perfect dangling cause pair. Another example comes from Back to the Future. And in this story, Marty is thrust back into 1955 with his DeLorean time machine. And there's a scene where he has just arrived in 1955. He's still wearing his radiation suit, and he has crashed his car into somebody's farm. And so he is trying to take off all of this kind of futuristic stuff and put on his normal clothing so he can walk into town and find out where he is. And at one point, the camera lingers on the fact that he is taking off his radiation suit, he's taking off his Walkman headphones, and he's placing those all down on the passenger seat of the car. And so we see a couple of items there that the camera seems to watch for a couple seconds. Of course, because it is a dangling cause and the use of foreshadowing, those things come back into play a couple minutes later when Marty needs to convince George, his father/friend in the 1950s, that he should ask out Lorraine. And so, as we see that scene where Marty is trying to convince his father to ask out his eventual mother, those items that the camera watched for a second come back into play. So in sum, foreshadowing is a very common literary device that we see in literature, and since we oftentimes are equating film to literature in this class, we can see that the overlaps are strong. And so hints are definitely given in literature as they are given in film. They're oftentimes very hard to find because we're more caught up in maybe the story or the character or how great or horrible somebody's acting is, but those pieces are there in terms of foreshadowing. And the only difference is that in film, we call them dangling causes because something is placed on early in the film and we have to wait a little while to see it develop and complete its cycle. So as always, if you have any questions, go ahead and bring those into class. We'll see if we can get those shored up. We will be watching some clips to illustrate some of these dangling cause pairs, and then we will be on our merry way. Thanks so much for listening. Have a good one, and we'll see you soon.